If Germany cannot manage a very dramatic transition, Germany will go from being the largest provider of funds to the EU to a net taker. And I don't see how the EU in that situation can exist.
Okay.
Sure. So again, it's those two issues of geography and demography. Now that the world is facing a deglobalization moment, geography is going to be far more important for determining who your trading partners are. And the demographic structure will determine who can play at all. Because if you don't have a lot of people in your 20s and your 30s, you're not going to do a lot of consumption. And if you do have a lot of people in your 20s and your 30s, you're going to protect that consumption and resist imports. If you have a lot of people in your 40s, 50s, and early 60s, you may be very productive, but you still have to have some place to sell your goods, which means you're going to have to be a bit of a security taker in order to access the markets that you need. And then, of course, you break down the global whole and the resources that we need and supply chains that span the world, that all goes away, and it's much more focused on the local. In that, Europe overall is a big loser. The demographic structure is beyond broken in most European countries, and the European continent is heavily dependent upon international trade in order to maintain its economic structure in its current form. And so the trauma of changing that is going to be extreme. The Western Hemisphere looks pretty good. It's net exporter of energy, net exporter of food, and it's in the process of doubling the size of the local industrial plant in preparation for what's going down in Germany and China right now. East Asia, it's like the only part of the world with a worse demographic structure than Europe, and the only part of the world that is more trade dependent than Europe. And so that is a place where these breakdowns get very real and very fast and very loud. Start by saying that what China has achieved since the year 2000 really is impressive. Yeah. They have increased their GDP by a factor of 4 to 5 based on who's doing the math. Now, we all have heard the stories of Chinese statistics and how they're questionable, but let's assume that 4 to 5 factor is off by 20 or 30%. That's still a really good growth story.
Yeah.
But it was a one-way trip. Two problems here. Number one, it was not paid for with trade or with consumption. It was paid for with debt. And China's debt today, compared to where it was in the year 2000, is 34 times what it was. So yes, their economy may be increased by a factor of 5, but their debt is increased by a factor of 34. To put this in European terms, imagine Greece if Greece had spent 5 times as much. That's China. That's not sustainable. And that is the story of Chinese economic development. It's not exports, it's debt. So that's kind of piece one. Piece two, they, like Germany, had a moment in time. One of the reasons that the German economy has done so well, especially since 1990, is the birth rate fell out back in the 70s. And so by the time you got to 1990, you had a lot of people who were 20 and older and very few children. And so for the next 30 years, 25 years, you had a lot of people in that 20-year-old to 45-year-old group, and eventually they aged into the 40 to the 65-year-old group. And that is where most economic activity happens. The younger group does the consuming, the older group does the production. And Germany was able to basically experience a double boom as a result. China has done the same thing. The one-child policy plus rapid urbanization gutted the younger generation. And so from 2000 until now, they've had a lot of adults and very few children. The problem we're facing now in China is that they have aged well past the point of no return. So this is the last generation that will see economic growth in China. In addition, the Chinese are now starting to grudgingly admit that they overcounted their population by in excess of 100 million people, with all of the missing millions under age 40. So China was aging very rapidly, much more rapidly than Germany, but it was still younger than Germany until the data revisions. And now it's significantly older. And this is the last decade for the German economic model because of aging, which means this is probably the last decade for the Chinese economic model as well. And while Germany focuses on quality and precision in education, China focuses on price. And that's not viable. They've already seen the cost of their labor go up by a factor of, I believe we're up to 16 now since the year 2000. They're no longer the low-cost provider. And with the labor basically dying on its feet, they never can be. they didn't get skilled enough to even attempt the sort of challenge that's in front of Germany. And that, of course, assumes that the Americans decide to try to help, which I find unlikely. You can't rule it out, and it is a one-man state now, so it's really hard to get a read, but I don't think so. The Chinese Navy is short range. They can't project more than about 1,500 kilometers from the coast, and even that assumes it's not wartime. If the ships actually have to dodge and weave, it's less than half that range. That's enough for Taiwan. It's not enough for anything else. And if there was a military conflict, a number of countries with naval assets, the Philippines, Vietnam, India, Australia, the United States, would be able to shut off the trade and energy arteries that allow China to be a modern industrialized power, with electricity. So shutting China down in a war scenario is really easy. And Xi knew all this a few years ago. Yeah. But in the last few years, he has so purged the system that no one's telling him anything. So it's entirely possible that he's now believing the propaganda that a Taiwan war could be encapsulated, that no one will intervene, that it'll be easy, and that the rest of the world will just suck it up and move on. Our experience with Ukraine is that none of that is true, but it is possible in a propaganda world that maybe he does believe it. I find it unlikely that he has descended into idiotic narcissism with that speed. But this isn't Putin. Putin still has an inner circle. We still bug his phone and read his faxes. Xi has no one. And you can't bug someone's brain. Aside from supplying weapons components and maybe even some weapons, there's really nothing that the Chinese can do to help. The front where it matters is just way too far away. And the Russians and the Chinese, it's always been a relationship of convenience. Not that it's insignificant. Yeah. But both of them have always felt that if they thought they could get a real deal with the United States, they would drop the other one in a heartbeat. I don't think that's changed. But even if the Russians are facing a complete collapse, I don't think the Chinese are going to get meaningfully involved. Yeah. They know in a world where they actively intervene is one where they go to public enemy number one in the United States. And they know what that means. Mm-hmm. They know they have to... The Russian system does not require an open globalized system to survive. It doesn't require economic growth to survive. China does. Its population is much more restive, and it's much more dependent upon the outside world simply to feed itself. Russia is a massive food exporter. So the Russians can eat a lot of privation and continue. The Chinese cannot. They just die. So the Chinese are always going to look for a way to have their cake and eat it too. And that's exactly what they've been doing. But if Russia were to collapse tomorrow, what we would probably see is the Chinese basically ask around to Japan, the United States, like, hey, do you mind if we go in and take some bits of this?
Yeah, possible. We will see. So I already see that we get some backlash on you being so pro-Ukrainian and pro against China and so on. So what's the bull case for China, for example? Is there a bull case?
The bull case. We are at a point where I don't think even if the United States wanted to rescue the Chinese that we could. I think the problem is too far advanced. I mean, we're nearing a situation in the United States strategically where, for primarily demographic reasons, the United States is going to have to make up a list of countries that we want to support moving forward. And it's very likely that Germany is going to be on that list. So you're looking at something on the scale of a Marshall Plan happening every year for the United States to sustain countries that it finds to be strategically important. We can choose to try to help China or try to help everyone else on our list. And the only way we would decide to try to help China would be if they basically did a strategic surrender. And even then, I think it's beyond America's capacity. It's better than we've had in a while.
Obama?
Obama was one of the least consequential, worst presidents we've ever had, because for 8 years he didn't leave the Oval Office. He didn't have a conversation with anyone, even his own allies. The reason everyone in Europe loves Obama is because he never called or showed up. He never asked anything of you, and that was bliss.
He was coughing a lot.
It's like since the Cold War ended, I'd say probably Bill Clinton was our least bad president, and W is our second least bad, and we've just got progressively worse until Trump. Biden is probably in the same quality level of George W. Bush overall, I'd say, which, is not great, but he's better than the last two. The reason I think he's a shoo-in